I want to welcome you softly tonight, the way a hush settles over a room just before sleep finds its way through the cracks. This is not a story that hurries, it's a story that breathes and drifts like a low fog over quiet water. I want to tell you something small about something impossibly big, a secret that hums behind the stars and folds itself into the corners of our thoughts when we're alone under an open sky. Before we begin, I should remind you that you don't have to hold all this at once. You can drift and doze and come back later if you need to. The story will wait. Let this be something you listen to when the world outside your window has gone still, when the hum of day gives way to the softer rhythm of your own breath. Maybe you're listening now by a lamp that's just been turned off, or maybe you've tucked yourself under a blanket with the sound of your heartbeat filling the spaces between my words. Either way, lean back, let the quiet open a door, and step through it with me. Sometimes, I wonder if the universe ever remembers its own childhood, or if it simply lives forward without glancing back. I sit alone on my porch most nights, when the air turns cold enough to make my thoughts sharper than they should be, and I tilt my face up to the dark, as if I might catch the faint scent of the beginning of time. The stars don't say much, but they have a way of making you think they know secrets they'd share, if only you were patient enough to listen properly. Tonight the telescope waits beside me, patient too, its single glass eye staring into a black that is never truly black, but instead a deep ocean of ancient whispers. I wonder how long it takes for a photon to decide where it's going. I wonder if it gets tired, if halfway through its endless journey it ever thinks maybe I should turn back and find another star to belong to. But light does not turn back, it travels without second thoughts or apologies. And if you follow it long enough, you find yourself tracing the fingerprints of galaxies, the softest beginnings of things too vast to hold in your head all at once. I lift the telescope's cover and breathe out a fog of warm air that vanishes into the cold night. Somewhere inside that breath are atoms forged in the bellies of dead stars, atoms that once drifted as free particles before gravity found them and persuaded them to cling together and burn. My fingers are stiff with the chill, but I adjust the focus anyway, slowly, patiently, as if the sky might feel me trying to see it more clearly, and lean a little closer in return. The eyepiece fills with pinpricks of old light, each one a quiet declaration that time is not a straight road, but a spiral we wander along without always noticing. I like to imagine that each star remembers the swirl of dust that shaped it, the hush before it flared awake and found itself suddenly bright in a darkness it had never felt before. Maybe the universe doesn't have a memory the way we do. Maybe it stores its recollections in the light itself, each wave a message carrying the story of how something once was, and how it still is if only you know how to look. I lean closer, pressing my eye to the glass, and for a moment everything else disappears: the porch, the creak of old wood beneath my chair, the soft ticking of the clock inside my house that keeps measuring moments I never seem to hold long enough. Out there, scattered and shining, is a cradle of sleepy matter drifting on currents of gravity and chance. In the distant smear of a nebula, I see the shape of a thought beginning, the soft insistence of particles gathering themselves like hands folded in prayer. They do not know they will become something bright, they do not care. They simply gather, pulled by a force that does not shout, but whispers, stay, stay closer, stay, until warmth comes, until the hush cracks open, and the first breath of starlight spills out like a promise kept in the dark for too long. I sit back, the eyepiece leaving a faint cold circle against my eyelid, and I close my eyes to imagine the swirl from within. What would it feel like to drift among those particles, to feel gravity's tug not as a calculation, but as a gentle invitation to belong? Maybe it would feel like leaning into someone's shoulder on a night when the world feels too wide to cross alone. Maybe it would feel like sleep itself, that quiet slip from waking thought into something softer and stranger. I think about how this swirling matter does not ask permission, it does not fear its own collapse. The gathering is the point, the pressing closer until fire is possible is the point. If I were braver, maybe I'd live that way too, drifting where the pull feels strongest, trusting that warmth waits on the other side of closeness. A breeze brushes my cheek, and the telescope shivers on its tripod, as if it too feels the hush wrapping tighter around the house. In the grass a cricket chirps once, then falls quiet, as if it too has turned its face skyward. I wonder how many nights it will take for this swirl of thought to become something heavier in me, a gravity I can't ignore. Maybe that's what stories are, tiny galaxies of memory, and wondering, spinning slowly in the space behind our ribs, until they grow heavy enough to burn. I look up again, past the telescope, past the neat ring of the eyepiece, past the porch roof to the blank canvas where so many beginnings wait hidden in the dark. Above me the stars do not hurry, they never do. They keep their stories patient in their cores, whispering them out as light that finds me here on a porch too small to hold all this wonder, yet somehow just big enough for one quiet observer, and a thought or two drifting far beyond the edge of the night. The wind shifts again, bringing with it the faint smell of pine and cold earth, and maybe something older, something like the scent of a universe that remembers the hush before it spoke its first word in light. I hold my breath for a moment, as if I might catch it on my tongue, taste the dust of ancient collisions, feel the swirl beneath my skin. When I open my eyes again, the stars are still there, patient as ever, waiting for me to look and look again. I know I could stay here all night tracing their slow stories, until the first edge of dawn peels the dark away, but even then I would not see the end. There is no end, not really, only a drifting from hush to hush, from swirl to swirl, from sleepy matter pressing closer and closer, until fire wakes and memory begins again in the warmth between particles that refuse to drift alone. And I think maybe that is all I really need to know tonight, that what gathers cannot help but shine, that what drifts will always find its pull, that somewhere in the silence the next swirl is waiting, and that even here alone with my telescope and my thoughts I am part of it, drifting too, drawn softly by a gravity that hums through bone and breath and memory, waiting patient for the next beginning to crack the hush wide open and whisper itself into light. Sometimes when the night settles too thick around my small house, and the last ember of conversation has long gone cold, I find myself drawn back to the telescope, as if it were a doorway left ajar in a house that otherwise forgets to breathe. Tonight I bring an old blanket with me, the corners frayed by years of fireside warmth and hasty foldings, and I drape it over my shoulders, like a soft reminder that while the sky may seem endless, I am still here, tethered by warmth and heartbeat, and the small shivers that remind me I am alive beneath this vast hush. I let the eyepiece wait a moment longer, and stand barefoot on the porch boards, feeling the wood's chill leach into my soles, until I almost believe I could root myself here like one of the pines that guard the yard. I think about how they stand each night, silent witnesses to every hush and windstorm and sigh I have ever let slip into this open dark. There is a comfort in their patience, in the way they keep their green needles sharp even when winter tries to coax them into sleep. Maybe the stars are not so different. They keep their sharp points even when the dark thickens around them. They hold their shape when I cannot hold mine. I step closer to the telescope, and this time I do not rush the focus. I let my breath fog the lens on purpose, just to watch it clear again, as if the glass were exhaling too. When I finally lean in, the first thing I see is not a star but a smear of something more like a memory than a shape, a soft glow that refuses to sharpen into a single point. It takes me a moment to realize I am staring at a cluster so distant that its light left home before the first forest sprouted on this planet, before our ancestors so much as wondered if the dark above them could be named or mapped or claimed by stories told in fireside hushes. I whisper a small apology for the centuries this light has traveled only to land here in my weary eye on a porch that creaks each time I shift my weight. The apology is not for the light really, but for my own smallness, the way my thoughts scatter when I try to hold something so old in my soft, unpracticed mind. Somewhere deep inside that cluster, new stars are still being born. It is happening right now, if now can mean what it does in the language of light, which is not the same as the now I measure by the ticking clock inside my living room. There is a strange comfort in knowing that beginnings and endings blur when you stretch your gaze wide enough that even death folds into birth, and every hush eventually cracks open if you wait long enough. I think of a particle drifting alone for eons, bumping along gravity's gentle slopes until at last it finds its place in a swirl that presses tight enough to spark. I think of how that spark travels outward, how it brushes past dust and gas, and other hopeful clusters carrying warmth where there was none before. I wonder if that is what we do too, each in our own way, bumping and drifting and gathering until the friction of closeness catches fire inside us, and we glow for a while before we drift again. There are stories we tell ourselves about how stars die, how they collapse inward or blow themselves apart in a blaze so fierce that it seeds the next swirl with heavier elements, bits of iron and gold and carbon, that find their way into planets, and water, and blood and breath. I like to imagine that somewhere in that endless scattering the particles remember where they came from, and that each time they gather again, they carry a faint echo of their last life, their last burning, their last hush before the next flare. Maybe that is what I am doing out here each night, piecing together my own echo, trying to remember the swirl I came from, the hush I will return to. The telescope's tripod hums faintly as the wind nudges it, a reminder that even here in my small safe patch of earth there are currents I cannot see moving everything just a hair off center. I adjust the angle, shifting from the distant cluster to a nearer patch of sky where a familiar star blinks steady and patient. I have looked at this star so many times, I almost feel it nod in recognition when I find it again. Its light is younger than the cluster, but older than any story my family ever handed down. I think about the ancestors who never saw this particular point of light because it had not yet spilled far enough to find them. I wonder what stories they made instead, what patterns they traced with their eyes, when the sky was just as wide, but the names were different. Sometimes I wish I could ask them what they called this hush, whether they felt as small and wide as I do, or whether they felt larger somehow, because the sky had not yet been pinned down by glass and mathematics, and the quiet certainty of proven truths. Maybe they did not wonder so much about the origin of the stars, but about their own place beneath them, about the shape their lives carved in the swirl of dust and bone and breath that would become me, standing here tonight alone, but not lonely. I shift my gaze again, drifting along the familiar belt of constellations that have held human wonder like a careful basket for thousands of years. Orion's belt still sharp against the deeper dark, the faint shimmer of Pleiades, like a handful of salt scattered on black silk. These shapes do not care what I name them, but I do it anyway, whispering the syllables under my breath, as if they were charms that could hold the world together for just one more hush. My toes curl against the wood as another breeze finds its way under the blanket, lifting the corner enough to remind me that warmth is something earned out here, something that must be held close. I breathe into the chill and imagine my breath as a nebula of its own tiny particles drifting outward, mixing with the night. Maybe one day some far future observer will collect the atoms I leave behind in this soft cold air and wonder what life once burned inside them. Maybe that is too much to wish, but the sky has taught me that wishes are not wasted, only scattered wide enough to find their own gravity someday. I rest my hand on the telescope's barrel, feeling its cold, steady patience, the way it holds the night for me, magnified and framed so I can pretend for a while that I am larger than the small hush of my porch. Out there the sleepy matter gathers and swirls and burns, but here I gather myself to each thought, drifting close until warmth stirs beneath my ribs and reminds me that drifting is not the same as. When the morning comes, it does not ask permission, it simply arrives, like a tide that rolls over the last hush of night, and leaves behind the faint traces of dreams that slip through my fingers before I am even fully awake. I find myself sitting at the kitchen table with my mug cooling between my hands, staring out the window at the thin line of trees that stand watch at the far edge of the yard. They are dark against the first pale stretch of light, their branches etched in such sharp detail they seem to hum with leftover starlight. The sky above them is already empty of the stars I held so carefully just hours ago, but I know they are still there, patient behind the blue, waiting for the dark to lift its curtain again. I press the mug to my lips, and the coffee is already lukewarm, a small disappointment that makes me smile despite myself, because it reminds me that here on this soft patch of earth time moves differently than the patient swirl above my roof. I think about the cluster I watched last night, the way its light slipped through the telescope's glass eye and landed in mine, like a secret whispered across unimaginable distance. It makes me wonder how much of what I see each day is really here, and how much is only the ghost of what once was drifting toward me long after the moment has passed. Maybe every face, every memory, every stray glance is just light finding its way home long after it left its source. The thought lingers as I stand to rinse the mug, the warm water a small mercy against my chilled hands. I look down at the curl of steam rising from the sink and imagine it as another swirl, a tiny mirror of those vast gatherings in the sky. Here the steam finds the air and lifts away, leaving only the faint trace of warmth behind. Out there the particles drift and press closer until warmth is born instead of lost. It is the same motion, but turned inside out, and I wonder if the universe notices the small echoes we make in our kitchens and porches and breath. I wipe my hands dry and step outside barefoot again, because I like the way the cold earth reminds me that I am anchored even when my thoughts want to drift. The grass is wet with dew, the sun not yet strong enough to burn it away, and I stand there letting the chill creep up my ankles and into my bones until the last edge of sleepiness has no choice but to scatter. The pines sway gently overhead, their needles catching the early light in a way that makes them look like they have been dipped in silver. I tilt my head back, half expecting to see a stray star clinging to the dawn, but there is only pale blue, empty and soft. Somewhere beyond that blue the sleepy matter still gathers, patient and slow, its swirl unaffected by my small morning rituals. I wonder if a galaxy ever notices the rise and fall of one heartbeat, one breath drawn in the quiet between dawn and day. Probably not, but that does not stop me from hoping that maybe in some small way my looking back at it completes the circle, the same way a photon completes its endless journey when it lands on the back of my eye and becomes a thought. I walk down to the edge of the yard where the grass gives way to the first tangle of underbrush that guards the trail I sometimes follow when I need to remember how to listen. The path is narrow, barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the branches reach in like curious hands brushing my arms as I pass. The damp smell of earth and old leaves fills my nose, and I breathe deeper, letting the weight of the house, the telescope, the waiting questions slip behind me for a moment. The path twists slightly before opening onto a small clearing where a fallen log has given up its long fight against decay. I sit on it, careful of the damp moss that clings to its bark, and close my eyes not to sleep, but to see what waits behind my eyelids when the world goes dark in this softer way. I imagine the particles again, drifting alone at first, then tugged closer by gravity's patient pull until they find themselves pressed into something more. I wonder what it feels like to surrender to that pull, to trust that closeness will not break you, but instead burn you brighter than you could ever burn alone. In the quiet, I feel the faint thrum of my own pulse in my fingertips, where they rest on the rough bark. It reminds me that I too am made of particles once flung wide by a star that could not hold its fire forever. There is a strange comfort in knowing that the iron in my blood, the calcium in my bones, the carbon that curls through every breath I release was once dust drifting through the same hush I gaze into each night. If I am honest, I do not always know what to do with that knowledge. Some nights it feels too big to carry tucked behind my ribs, like a secret that wants to burst through skin and syllable all at once. Other nights it feels like a lullaby soft enough to coax me to sleep before I can even whisper it back to the stars. The clearing is quiet but not empty. Birds stir in the branches above, hopping from twig to twig with small bursts of wing beats that scatter droplets of dew into tiny suns where the new light catches them. A squirrel pauses on a low branch, its body still except for the flick of its tail as it studies me with black unblinking eyes. I nod at it, a small greeting to remind myself that I am not the only watcher here. Maybe it sees me as just another shape in the clearing, another ripple in the morning hush. Maybe it does not wonder at all. I envy that simplicity, sometimes the way a creature can live so fully in the moment that it has no room for the swirl of questions that wake me at midnight and pull me to the porch and the telescope's cold glass eye. I stand when my legs grow stiff, brushing the damp bark from the back of my pants, and follow the path back toward the house, each step pressing a little warmth back into my feet. By the time I reach the yard again, the sun has climbed higher, the last edge of dawn slipping away like a thought I meant to write down, but lost somewhere between waking and walking. I glance at the porch where the telescope waits under its cover, patient as ever, as if it knows I will come back to it when the hush falls again. Inside, I fill the kettle and listen to its gentle rattle on the burner, the small hiss of water waking into steam. I think of the afternoon settles over my house like a soft blanket folded carefully across a lap that needs its weight more than its warmth. I spend the slow hours with small tasks, letting my hands drift from dish to shelf to drawer, arranging the small pieces of my daily life as if each one were an anchor keeping me from drifting too far out among the quiet swirl that waits each night beyond my roof. The kettle sighs on the stove again, a gentle reminder that even steam carries its story upward, curling into the air with a warmth that fades before it ever reaches the ceiling. I stand by the window watching the shifting pattern of sunlight as it slips through the branches outside the pines, tracing soft lines of shadow across the worn floorboards. The dust motes drift lazily in those beams, tiny particles of who knows what dancing in the bright like echoes of the drifting matter I think about when the sky darkens. Maybe each floating speck once belonged to something solid, a piece of bark or skin or thread that gave itself up to the air without protest. Now it hangs in that golden light, weightless and aimless, until gravity tugs it gently to the floor. I tap the glass with a fingertip and imagine for a moment that I am just another particle drifting through a shaft of light, waiting to settle somewhere soft enough to hold me for a while. The day hums quietly around me, the fridge muttering to itself in the corner, the faint creak of the walls as they shift and breathe with the sun's slow slide toward the western trees. I hear a bird outside, its call sharp and sudden before it lifts away, leaving only the hush that follows after sound. I wonder if the galaxy ever notices the hush we wrap ourselves in during moments like this, when the world inside is so still you can almost hear the heartbeat of the air itself. I step out onto the porch, letting the screen door whisper close behind me, and lean against the railing, feeling the wood warm beneath my palms. The breeze is soft but steady, carrying the faint scent of pine and the sharper edge of earth still damp from last night's quiet rain. I look up at the pale sky, washed clean of stars by daylight, but I know they are there, tucked behind that blue veil, waiting for dusk to open it again. It is comforting, this promise, that what is hidden is not lost, only waiting for the right darkness to bloom. I think about the first time I looked through a telescope, how clumsy my hands were, how clumsy they still are sometimes when the focus slips and I have to find the swirl again. I remember the way my heart caught when I first understood that the light I was seeing had been traveling longer than I could easily hold in my mind, longer than any story my family ever told, longer than any dream I could cradle on sleepless nights. That first glimpse taught me how small I was, but it did not make me feel smaller. It made me feel threaded into something so wide and soft that there was room for my smallness to drift without fear. I think maybe that is what keeps me leaning into the eyepiece each night, what calls me back even when the cold bites at my fingertips and the dark presses close against my shoulders. There is something tender about standing on a wooden porch built by hands that never touched a star, and yet using that humble perch to send my gaze farther than my feet could ever carry me. The breeze shifts, and I close my eyes for a moment, letting the warmth on my skin slip away to be replaced by the cool breath that drifts down from the higher branches. I imagine what it would feel like to drift on that breeze, to rise above the pines and the roof and the quiet hum of my little kitchen, to slip past the clouds and the thinning air and find myself pressed against the hush that holds the stars. Would I feel myself scatter, or would I find some new gravity pulling me closer to a swirl that welcomes drifting dust the way a hand welcomes another in the dark? I open my eyes again, and the sky seems a little deeper now, the blue fading toward the edge where dusk will begin its slow climb. I step down from the porch and walk barefoot through the grass, the blades cool and sharp beneath my feet, a small reminder that the earth still has its hold on me. At the far end of the yard, the trees stand in a patient row, their trunks wide enough to hide secrets if they had any to keep. I press my palm against the rough bark of one and close my eyes again, as if the tree might share with me the memory it carries in its rings, the slow, patient record of years that pass without hurry, without fuss, marked only by growth and quiet standing. I wonder if the tree feels the swirl above it, or if it knows only the pull of roots and rain and the sun's soft promise that warmth will return no matter how cold the hush grows. Maybe that is enough for it to stand and reach and stand again year after year, while I tilt my head back and ask the same questions the stars never quite answer. The wind slips through the branches above me, and a single needle drifts down, brushing my shoulder before settling at my feet. I pick it up and hold it between my fingers, its green still sharp despite the fall. I think of the particles again, the sleepy matter gathering, pressing closer, finding warmth in the hush where there was none before. I wonder how many swirls it took to shape the carbon that makes this needle, or the iron that slips through my veins, or the light that finds my eyes each night through the cold glass of the telescope's patient lens. I tuck the needle into my pocket, a small reminder that even here, rooted and grounded, I am still part of the drifting, part of the swirl, part of the quiet promise that what gathers will shine. The shadows stretch longer now, the sky softening at its edges, as the first hints of dusk brush the tops of the trees. I walk back toward the house, slowly letting each step press the grass flat before lifting again, leaving only the faintest trace that I passed this way. On the porch I pause, my hand resting on the railing as I watch the last gold slip from the yard to be replaced by the soft indigo that will soon hold the first stars. The telescope waits, its cover still in place, but I know it will not be long before I lift it away and let my eye find its way back to the distant hush where sleepy matter dreams itself into flame. Inside, the kettle hums again, a soft promise that warmth is always within reach if I am willing to wait for it to boil, if I am willing to wrap my hands around it, if I am willing to believe that even the smallest swirl can hold the heat of a star pressed close in the hush of an old night that remembers how to gather itself just enough to burn bright and steady one more time. I like how the dusk arrives without any fanfare, slipping in between the branches and over the rooftop so gently I almost miss the moment when day becomes night, when the world exhales its last warmth, and the hush settles over the yard like a soft shawl draped across shoulders, waiting for the first breath of stars to stir against it. I stand on the porch, the old blanket wrapped tight around my shoulders, the kettle cooling behind me on the table. Inside, steam still drifting from the spout like a whisper that cannot bear to vanish too quickly. I have brought the telescope out again, cradling it like a fragile secret I am not ready to share with the dawn. I set it down carefully, checking the tripod legs, running my fingertips along the cold barrel, as if it too remembers every night. I have pressed my eye against its glass to find the distant swirl that waits so patiently in the dark. I breathe out and watch my breath join the hush, curling upward, to be lost among the bare branches overhead. For a moment, I stand very still, listening, not for anything in particular, but for the way the quiet folds itself around me like a soft memory. I did not know I still carried the pines rustle in the breeze, their needles brushing each other in a sound that might be mistaken for a voice if I let my mind drift far enough from this porch, from this small patch of ground. I focus the telescope, slowly finding the first bright pinprick in the deepening sky, a familiar star that winks at me, as if amused that I have returned once again to my humble vigil. I lean in the cold glass, pressing a faint ring against my skin, and for a moment all I see is that small bright light, a promise that what drifts can also burn if only it trusts the hush enough to hold it close. I think about the swirl again, the sleepy matter drifting through an endless dark until gravity catches it in its patient hands, pulling it closer, tighter, whispering to it until the hush cracks open and warmth spills out like a secret finally told. I imagine what it would feel like to be one of those particles drifting alone for so long that the idea of pressing close to another feels impossible, until it is not, until the closeness becomes all there is, the push of gravity, the friction of collision, the soft bloom of warmth, where there was only cold. I move the telescope slightly, tracing the sky with slow, careful turns, finding the faint smudge of a distant cluster so far that its light left home before the first story ever rose up from a human throat to drift toward another ear in the dark. I think about those first stories whispered under skies not so different from this one, stories that tried to explain the hush, the swirl, the drift, the burn, stories that wrap the mystery in names and shapes and myths that still cling to the constellations even as our eyes and our glass have reached deeper than the old names ever dreamed. I wonder what the first watcher felt, kneeling on cold ground, tracing the patterns with a finger lifted to the stars. Maybe they felt the same pull I do, the same strange gravity that tugs at the ribs, that says, look closer, stay longer, let the hush wrap around you until you understand that you are part of the drift too. I shift my weight on the porch, the boards creaking softly under my feet, the breeze finding its way beneath the blanket to lift the hem of my sleeve, as if to remind me that warmth is always something borrowed here, something coaxed and gathered in, held close against the wide open hush. I pull the blanket tighter and lean in again. The cluster comes into sharper view, the swirl of ancient light threading through my eye into the quiet space behind my ribs, where I keep all the questions I do not ask aloud. I think about how light travels without pause or complaint, how it moves through emptiness and dust and time itself, carrying with it the memory of where it began, and I wonder if that memory ever fades, if the photon ever forgets the warmth that first sent it spinning out into the dark. I like to imagine it does not. I like to believe that somewhere in its wave it carries a tiny echo of that first fire, that first swirl, that first hush cracking open to let a single spark slip free and find its way across billions of years to land here in my waiting, I step back from the telescope, blinking against the chill that settles into my eyelashes, and I close my eyes, trying to hold the shape of that cluster in my mind. Without the help of the glass, I see the swirl, the drift, the press of sleepy matter gathering itself into warmth and light. I see it, and I wonder if somewhere far off someone else stands under a different sky, looking back toward me, tracing the same hush with their own careful breath. I open my eyes again, the stars clearer now, scattered like salt across a black table, waiting for a hand to sweep through them and gather them into something new. I think of the sleepy matter drifting, always drifting, never wasted, each particle a promise that what drifts alone will someday find its pull, its warmth, its place in the endless hush. I rest my hand on the telescope, feeling the cold metal steady under my palm, a reminder that looking is its own kind of gathering, that every night I stand here I press closer to something I cannot hold, but that somehow holds me all the same. The wind shifts again, brushing my cheek with a softness that makes me think of the hush between heartbeats, the quiet space where warmth gathers before it spills outward into the veins, into the breath, into the slow exhale that drifts skyward to join the endless swirl. I step back into the house, leaving the telescope to keep its silent watch over the porch. For now, the kettle is cold, but I light the burner again, watching the blue flame catch and curl beneath the metal, a small star in my kitchen, a reminder that warmth can be kindled in the smallest places if I am patient enough to wait for the hush to crack open. I wrap my fingers around the mug when the steam rises again and carry it to the window, where I stand in the soft glow of the porch light, looking out at the dark that holds the swirl, the drift, the promise of warmth yet to come. I think about tomorrow and the next night and the next, how each one will bring its own hush, its own drift, its own patient gathering. I think about the sleepy matter waiting in the dark, pressing closer particle by particle until the warmth comes, until the hush breaks open, until the swirl remembers itself and shines once more, and I lift the mug to my lips, sip the warmth, and know that I too am part of that promise, drifting, patient, pressing closer, waiting for the hush to crack and the light to come through. The hush tonight feels different, as if the darkness has thickened its edges, wrapping around the porch and the yard and the patient pines in a way that softens every sound, until even the rustle of my blanket sounds like a word I have forgotten how to speak. I sit in the old chair, my legs tucked beneath me, the telescope turned toward a patch of sky I have not visited in weeks, a corner where the stars lean closer together, as if they have secrets only they can keep. I sip slowly from the mug I brought out, the steam rising like a small ghost that fades into the cold before I can catch it in my hands. My breath joins it, drifting in small puffs that vanish above my head without ever reaching the branches. I rest my palm on the telescope, feeling the hum of the night slip through the metal into my skin, as if the hush wants to remind me that I am part of it, whether I choose to notice or not. I lean forward, pressing my eye to the glass, waiting for the shapes to gather themselves out of the blur. The first star that greets me is not one I know by name, though I am sure it has one tucked away in some catalog or whispered by someone long before my breath ever learned how to shape questions around the hush. I watch its light, steady and soft, blinking only when the wind nudges the telescope and makes the world tremble for half a heartbeat. I think about how that single star might already be gone, its warmth snuffed out long before I ever thought to look, its light only now arriving, patient and loyal to a promise made before I was born. I wonder if the star knows I am here, waiting for its ghost to find me, if it feels my small warmth echoing back through the glass. I shift the telescope slowly, tracing the dark for the faint smudge of a galaxy whose name I read once in a book, so worn the pages turn soft at the edges like cloth. I find it where I left it, hidden in the black, like a thought I tuck behind my ribs when the world asks too much. The swirl is faint, more suggestion than shape. a gathering of sleepy matter drifting pressed close enough to glimmer at the edges. I imagine leaning into that swirl, letting it wrap around me, the way dusk wraps around this yard, pressing its hush into my skin until I cannot tell where my breath ends and the dark begins. I think about the first time I heard the word galaxy spoken out loud in a classroom that smelled of pencil shavings and chalk, the teacher's voice rising and falling as if she too were drifting through that endless swirl without quite knowing how to land. I remember tracing the shapes on cheap paper, trying to believe that something so vast could fit inside my small mind if I pressed the lines hard enough into the page. Maybe that was the beginning of this hush, this quiet wanting that keeps me here each night, my face pressed to the cold glass, my thoughts drifting far past the edge of what I can see. I breathe out again, the warm curl of air fogging the eyepiece for a moment before clearing. The swirl comes back into focus, and I watch it the way you might watch a candle flicker on a windowsill safe behind glass, while the wind taps gently at the panes, asking to come inside. The galaxy does not move, not in any way I can see, but I know it spins patient and slow, each star drifting on its own path, held by gravity's soft hand, pressed just close enough to stay warm. I wonder if the stars ever wish to break free, if they ever tire of the endless orbit, the hush that never quite cracks open enough to let them drift alone. But maybe they know what I am still learning, that warmth is not something found in the drifting but in the gathering, in the press of sleepy matter into flame. I sit back for a moment, rubbing my eyes, the cold seeping into my fingertips where they rest on the metal rim. The wind picks up, rattling the branches overhead, making the pines whisper secrets I will never understand. But I listen anyway, because sometimes listening is enough. I look out across the yard at the faint outline of the trail that slips into the trees, the same path I walk when the day feels too sharp and I need the hush to smooth my edges. I imagine walking it now, the ground soft beneath my feet, the branches catching the moonlight in sharp silver threads that guide me deeper until the night folds around me so tightly I can almost hear my own heartbeat echo off the bark. I do not move, though I stay here wrapped in my blanket, tethered to this porch by the quiet weight of the telescope, the mug now emptied but still warm in my hands. I think of the swirl again, of the galaxy drifting patient in its dance of light and shadow and gravity's hush. I wonder how many times it has torn itself apart only to gather again, pressing closer, spinning faster until warmth bloomed in places it never expected. I wonder if that is what we do too, gather, scatter, drift, find each other again in the hush. When the night leans close enough to hear us breathing, I set the mug down on the railing, listening to the soft click of ceramic against wood, a small sound swallowed immediately by the larger quiet that waits to gather every noise into itself. I lean in again, letting the eyepiece cool my cheek as I find the swirl once more, the light older than any promise I could ever make, older than the pines, older than the porch, older than the hands that built this telescope so I could press my questions against the night. I trace the edge of the galaxy with my eye, following the faint arc of dust and light, wondering if some far watcher is tracing me to a tiny swirl on a tiny porch, sending out warmth in the only way I know how, by looking, by listening, by drifting just close enough to believe that the hush will hold me. When the dawn finally comes, the wind eases again, and for a moment the branches fall silent, the only sound my own slow breath rising and falling. The hush presses closer, a soft gravity pulling my thoughts into the swirl where sleepy matter waits to gather itself into something bright enough to light the cold. I tell myself I will sit here until the first edge of morning peels the stars away, one by one, folding them back into the hush until they are ready to drift out again and find my waiting eye tomorrow, or the night after, or the night after that. As long as there is dark enough to hold them and quiet enough to listen, I will be here, pressed close to the swirl, wrapped in my blanket, my breath drifting into the cold, waiting for the sleepy matter to remember itself and shine. When the sun rises, I expect the hush to lift, but instead it lingers pressed into the corners of my house, like the soft echo of a dream that has not yet decided to leave me entirely. I stand at the kitchen sink rinsing out my mug, watching the last swirl of steam slip from the open window and vanish into the pale light beyond the glass. The grass outside is slick with dew, each blade catching the early sun like a shard of something fragile scattered across the yard, and for a moment I see the whole space as a small reflection of the sky above me, each drop of water a star, each blade a path bending under the weight of something that does not yet know how to stay still. I dry my hands slowly, letting the warmth of the water slip from my skin so the chill of the morning can remind me that this hush belongs to the living too, not only the drifting dust and hidden swirl above the pines. I slip on my shoes and step out onto the porch, blinking against the brightness that pushes softly at my eyelids. The telescope stands where I left it, its cover snug around the glass, its legs braced against the boards that remember every night I have stood here leaning forward as if I could tip myself into the swirl if I only found the right angle, the right star, the right breath to hold me. I brush my fingers along the tripod, a small promise that I will return when the dusk folds back over this yard, when the hush returns with its soft edges and its invitation to drift. I walk toward the trail at the edge of my yard, my footsteps pressing into the grass, leaving behind small dark impressions that fade almost as soon as I pass through. The brush is damp, the leaves brushing my legs with cold reminders that the world holds its own quiet swirl close. Even when I am too busy watching the sky to notice, I follow the narrow bend where the path slips between the oldest pines, their trunks wide enough to swallow secrets if I were to whisper them into the bark. I press my palm against one rough surface, feeling the steady patience that lives beneath the layers, the rings wrapped tight like soft records of every hush, every wind, every long dry summer. When the roots reach deep enough to remember water, I breathe in the scent of needles and damp earth, and feel my shoulders ease, as if the forest itself is reminding me that drifting does not always mean far. Sometimes it means deeper into what stands still waiting. I take my time, stepping over fallen branches that crack softly under my weight, each sound swallowed by the hush that thickens the farther I walk. The canopy above me filters the sunlight into pale ribbons that slide across my hair, my face, my shoulders, as if the day wants to wrap me in its own version of warmth, not as sharp as the kettle steam, not as wide as the swirl, but here enough that I pause and lift my head to feel it settle in my bones. I find a clearing I have not visited in months, a ring of stones half buried under moss where I once sat and watched the dawn slip over the tops of the trees, too young then to understand how patient light can be, how it finds every crack, every shadow, every quiet space where sleepy matter waits. I lower myself onto one of those stones, now feeling the cool damp seep through the fabric of my pants, a small shiver that anchors me here instead of drifting away on the thought that wants to tug me skyward. I close my eyes and let the hush fold around me thicker than it does on the porch, where the wind can slip in and remind me how thin the line is between inside and out. Here the hush has weighted, presses into my chest, and quiets the hum behind my ribs, the hum that follows me when I stand too long at the telescope watching light that left home before my first breath. I think about that light now, not as a line, but a loop drifting out only to find its way back again, folding over itself the way a river braids its currents around a stone. I wonder if the swirl in the sky knows its reflection waits here too, not only in the glass of my patient telescope, but in the way the pines lean into the breeze without letting go, in the way the moss clings to the stones even when the frost tries to pry it loose, in the way I sit here alone, and not alone, pressed close to a memory I never quite learned to name. I let my eyes open slowly, the green overhead shifting as a breeze pushes through the tallest branches, needles sighing against each other, like a soft reminder that even what stands rooted feels the drift. I trace the edge of a fern with my fingertip, its delicate fronds curled tight around droplets of water that catch the broken sunlight and scatter it back into my eyes, tiny stars held in the palm of something so easily overlooked. I smile at the thought that the universe does not always announce its wonders with loud collisions and bright flares. Sometimes it gathers them here in the hush of a damp clearing on the edge of a path that remembers my footsteps even when I forget the way back. I think about going deeper, but my stomach grumbles, reminding me that the hush might feed my questions, but it does not warm my blood the way a hot mug does. I stand brushing moss from my palm, feeling the texture cling for a moment before giving up to the pull of gravity. I step back through the trees, listening to the way my movements stir the small life around me, the hush parting like a gentle curtain only to drift closed again as soon as I pass by. The porch greets me like an old friend, the boards creaking under my returning weight, the telescope waiting its patient. I turned inward for now, but I know the swirl will call me back tonight when the sky folds over the day's noise and gives me room to listen again. I step inside, to the kettle, to the cup, to the simple warmth that gathers in my hands while I stand by the window and watch the trail where the hush waits, the swirl waits, the drift goes on. Whether I stand still or follow, I sip slowly, letting the steam fog the glass just enough that the reflection looking back at me seemed softer, gentler, a swirl of my own sleepy matter pressed close to bone and breath, and the promise that when the night comes I will lift the cover, lean in, find the faint shape waiting where I left it, and press my questions against the hush until they glow quiet and patient, drifting just close enough to warm me from the inside out. The afternoon drifts by in a soft hush of small chores and gentle thoughts that cling to the edge of my mind like dew to the tips of grass just before the sun tips over the line of trees at the far edge of the yard. I find myself moving through the house like a ghost that has forgotten what it was looking for, my hands brushing along tabletops, pausing at the windows where the light gathers and shifts its weight from room to room, as if it too is searching for something. I stand by the sink again, fingers trailing through warm water, watching how it catches the sunlight and scatters it across the faucet, tiny flares of brightness that remind me of the way stars gather themselves from sleepy matter drifting through the cold dark. I think about the swirl waiting for me tonight, the old familiar promise that once the hush settles over the porch and the kettle hums its soft song, I will lift the cover from the telescope and lean my face against the cold glass, searching for that faint shape that drifts at the edge of what my eye can hold. The kettle itself sits ready on the counter, a quiet sentinel that knows my hands so well it does not rattle when I fill it, just hums in that low, steady way. When the flame finds its belly, warming the water that will in turn warm my fingers and my ribs, and that small hidden place behind my sternum where the hush curls. When the world outside grows too sharp, I open the door and step onto the porch, the afternoon sun spilling over the railing, painting the boards with gold and shadow. The telescope waits, too silent under its cover, its legs braced against the soft sigh of the breeze. I reach out and rest my palm on its metal body, feeling the faint chill that lingers even in the daylight, a reminder that the dark will come sooner than I expect. And with it the hush that makes the swirl clearer. The yard hums with the small life of late day. A bird hops across the grass, its shadow flickering across the ground. Like a thought I almost catch then lose again. A squirrel scolds me from the low branch of the pine, as if reminding me that while I stand here drifting between sky and porch, the world keeps its pulse steady in the leaves and the twigs and the soft rustle of wings that do not care for telescopes or swirling dust or questions that wake me before dawn. I sit on the porch steps, letting my blanket slip around my shoulders, though the air is still warm enough to hold me without it. I close my eyes and listen to the breeze brushing through the needles overhead, each sigh a word I cannot quite catch, but understand anyway, in that place behind my ribs, where the hush lives, I think about the swirl again, how it never demands that I know its secrets, how it drifts patient and slow through its own dance of gathering and burning and scattering again. I think about how even the scatter is not waste, how each particle finds its next place in the drift, pressed close to something new, warmed again by a closeness it did not know it needed until it found itself gathered up. I open my eyes, and the sun has dipped lower, the shadows stretching long across the yard, the pine's trunk casting a dark stripe that reaches almost to my feet. I stand brushing off the blanket and step into the yard, the grass cool beneath my soles, reminding me that the warmth of day only lingers if you hold it close. I walk toward the trail, my steps soft against the earth, the hush growing thicker as I pass under the first arch of branches. The trees hold the last light in their upper limbs, letting only scraps and slivers fall through to the ground where I move like a drifting thought, my breath quiet, my hands loose at my sides. I find the same clearing I sat in yesterday, the stones patient, the moss damp, where the day's warmth could not quite reach. I lower myself again, feeling the cold slip through the fabric of my pants into my bones, a soft anchor that keeps my thoughts from drifting too far. All at once, I see the swirl again, not through glass but through the soft map behind my eyelids that remembers the faint arc of stars pressing close enough to burn. I think about how light leaves a home it can never return to, how it carries the memory of that warmth across billions of years, landing on the back of my eye to become a thought that hums through bone and breath until it finds its place in this hush. I wonder if that light feels its own longing, if it knows it will never circle back, only drift forward forever, pressed into new shapes by the gravity of what waits ahead. I open my eyes, and the clearing seems brighter for a moment, the sky overhead thinning into the first hint of dusk, that pale veil that slips between day and night, carrying in its folds the promise that the hush will deepen soon, that the swirl will appear again, waiting for my question, my patient breath. I trace the rim of a small stone with my fingertip, feeling the rough edge, the tiny flecks of lichen that cling to its shadowed side. I think about particles pressed tight enough to hold their shape long after the warmth that shaped them has drifted on. I think about my own bones, the iron that hums in my blood, the carbon that slips from my lungs with every sigh, drifting upward to join the hush above the pines. I stand again, the path before me darker now, the air cool enough that I draw the blanket tighter around my shoulders. As I step back toward the porch, the house greets me with its soft creaks and familiar shadows, the kettle waiting, the mug waiting, the telescope waiting. I light the flame and listen to the low hum of water waking into steam, the quiet rush that reminds me that warmth is something gathered to, coaxed out of stillness with patience and breath. I wrap my hands around the mug when it is full, the steam curling against my chin, my cheeks, my nose as I step outside again, the sky now deepening into that first true stretch of dark where the swirl lives. The hush comes back thicker, pressing against my shoulders like a soft cloak. I lift the cover from the telescope, feeling the chill in the glass, the faint echo of all the nights I have leaned in and traced the swirl with my eye. I breathe out once, twice, watching my breath drift into the hush, as if it too carries a memory, a particle pressing close to another before it fades. I lean in, the eyepiece cold against my. Sometimes I think the hush grows thicker on certain nights, as if it knows I am listening more carefully than usual and wants to wrap itself tighter around the house and the yard and the dark stretch of trees that stand like patient watchers at the edge of my little world. Tonight feels like one of those nights when the quiet comes with its own weight, pressing gently into my shoulders as I step onto the porch, the blanket already draped over my arms before the kettle has finished humming its soft promise of warmth. The telescope waits, uncovered this time, because I knew even before the sun slipped behind the trees that I would be here again, leaning forward, pressing my eye to the cold glass, letting the swirl gather itself inside the narrow tunnel of my sight, until all I can hold is its patient drift. I pause before I lean in tonight, my breath rising in faint curls that vanish into the space above my head, where the first stars are just beginning to reveal themselves, old friends blinking. Awake one by one, I lift the mug to my lips, letting the steam fog my vision for a heartbeat before I set it down on the railing beside the tripod that would cool against my fingers where they linger, as if they too are searching for some thread to hold onto in this hush. I think about how the swirl waits each night unchanged by the small shape of my questions, how it spins on its own terms, gathering light and dust and sleepy matter the way my breath gathers in, the cold pressing close enough to remind me that everything drifts towards something if you let it. I think about how light moves through that swirl, carrying its stories outward into the hushed stories I can only touch when the glass brings them near enough to slip behind my eyes and rest there like a secret folded into bone. I wonder what it would feel like to drift inside that swirl, not with my eyes, but with every part of me pressed into the soft pull of gravity that knows how to hold without asking for anything in return. I wonder if the particles ever notice when warmth flickers awake among them, if they hum with the memory of what they were before they pressed so close they could not help but burn. I lean in now, my eyes settling into place against the cold circle of the eyepiece. The first star that greets me is one I know well, a steady point that has guided me back again and again to the deeper shapes waiting behind it. Tonight it seems brighter, as if it knows I need its anchor before I drift too far into thought. I trace past it, slowly guiding the glass across the sky with the same careful motion I used to fold the blanket over my shoulders. When the night air presses too sharp, the swirl comes into view, softer than the star, but wider, deeper, older than any light I can name. Its edges frayed into the black the way my thoughts fray into sleep. When the hush has done its patient work, I watch the swirl the same way I have watched steam rise from a mug drifting upward only to fade before it can brush the ceiling, the same way I have watched my own breath curl into the cold, caught for a moment in moonlight before the dark folds it away. I wonder if the swirl ever feels its own edges fading, if it knows that drifting is not the same as disappearing, that what scatters does not vanish, only shifts shape, waiting for the next hush, the next pull, the next warmth, waiting for gravity to gather it once more. I pull back, blinking away the faint sting of cold against my cheek, and wrap my hands around the mug, feeling the heat slip into my palms, my knuckles, the small hollow between thumb and forefinger. I let my eyes adjust to the open sky for a moment, the swirl now only a memory pressed behind my eyelids, but still there, still drifting somewhere above the pines that sway gently in a breeze I cannot feel from where I stand on the porch. I think about the path that winds behind those trees, the clearing I have found so many times when the world felt too sharp under the sun and I needed the hush that waits in the shadows to gather me back together. I think about how even there, surrounded by bark and moss and the soft smell of old leaves, I carry the swirl with me, a shape that hums behind every breath, every question, every small promise I make to return when the dusk folds over this house again. I lift the mug, sip slowly, let the warmth anchor me here, while my mind drifts outward, tracing the curve of the swirl the way I might trace the rim of a familiar cup when my hands have nothing else to hold. I wonder if somewhere far inside that swirl new light is being born even now, in this hush that wraps the yard and the porch and the small shape of me standing here alone. I wonder if particles are pressing close, if warmth is stirring, if a new glow is preparing itself for the long drift outward, carrying with it the memory of that first hush, cracking open to make room for fire. I wonder if one day, some distant, I will find that light pressing its face against glass the way I do, and feel the same soft hum behind the ribs that says, yes, you are small, but you are part of this too, drifting, gathering, pressing close enough to warm something you will never see. I lean in again, letting the eyepiece find the swirl once more, the shape patient and unchanged by my watching, my questions, my breath ghosting across its cold lens. I watch until my eyes blur, until the hush thickens, until I cannot tell where my breath ends and the drift begins. I watch until the mug in my hands cools, until the steam no longer rises, until my shoulders ache from leaning, but I do not move, because the swirl waits, because the hush holds me, because somewhere inside the patient drift warmth stirs, and I want to feel it hum through my bones, the way starlight hums through glass when the night is soft enough to listen. I close my eyes behind the lens just for a moment, letting the swirl settle behind them, like a quiet promise that when I lift my face from the glass, the hush will still be here, the pines will still stand, the path will still wind into the dark, the kettle will still hum its low song when I need it to, and the swirl will gather itself again tonight, tomorrow, every night. I remember how to look, how to listen, how to drift, just close enough to warm my small breath against the endless dark that holds all of us gently in its patient swirl. I wake before the dawn finds my window, the hush still thick inside the walls, as if the night does not want to slip away, yet holding its breath in the corners of the room, where the first soft light cannot quite reach. I lie there for a moment, eyes open to the ceiling, tracing the shape of the quiet that hums above my head, imagining that somewhere behind the plaster and beams the same particles that drift through the swirl above my roof rest here too, caught for now in wood and paint and the slow warmth that lingers in this small house. I rise without turning on a light, letting the cool floor wake me fully as I move through the hallway and into the kitchen, where the kettle waits silent and expectant on the stove. The mug sits beside it, clean and ready, as if it too knows I will fill it soon, that the hush will soften when the water sings its low song, and the first curl of steam finds my face. I stand by the window, while the water warms my palms, pressed flat to the cold glass that looks out onto the yard still hidden by the last breath of night. I think of the swirl waiting up there beyond the pines, and the thin line of roof that frames my little world. I think of the light still drifting toward me, light that left its home before my bones knew warmth, before my hands learned to wrap around a mug and find comfort in its simple weight. I close my eyes and feel the hush shift inside my chest, the way it always does when I remember that I am small but not separate, that my breath hums with the same quiet promise that carries the swirl across an endless dark. The kettle sighs its low song, and I lift it carefully, pouring the water until the steam rises in soft ribbons that brush my cheeks. I wrap my hands around the mug and stand by the door, breathing in the warmth and the faint scent of tea that drifts upward, like a reminder that not all warmth must come from fire and stars. Sometimes it is enough to hold it close, to taste it slowly, to let it gather behind my ribs where the hush settles when the world is still. I step outside onto the porch, the boards cool under my feet, the old blanket draped across my shoulders, like the sky draped over the yard, waiting for the first edge of sun to lift the hush and make room for the small life that stirs when the dark lets go. I stand there sipping slowly, watching the faint outline of the pines emerge from the black, their trunks patient and wide, their branches catching the earliest light before it reaches me. I think about the path that slips between them, the clearing I have visited so many times, when the questions inside me press too close, and I need the hush of moss and bark to remind me that drift is not the same as loss, that what scatters finds its shape again if you wait long enough, if you listen carefully enough. I finish the last swallow of tea and set the mug on the railing, the wood cold against my fingers, as I lift the cover from the telescope, its glass still fogged from the night, its lens holding the memory of my last breath pressed close to it hours ago. I lean in, finding the swirl again faint in the last darkness before the sun claims the sky. My eye traces its edges, the soft smear of light gathered in ways I can almost understand but never fully hold. My breath goes across the eyepiece, and for a heartbeat, I see my own reflection layered over the distant swirl, a reminder that even here pressed against the hush, I am part of it, drifting through my own orbit, gathering warmth in small ways that do not need to be bright to be enough. I pull back and look up with my eyes alone, letting the swirl fade behind the deepening blue where it waits for the night to fold back over this yard and the hush to settle again. The sky brightens by degrees, the stars slipping away one by one like secrets folded into pockets, until the dusk calls them back. I wrap the blanket tighter around my shoulders and watch the trees sway in the first breeze of morning, their needles brushing each other in a hush that belongs to them alone, a hush that carries the promise of roots pressed deep and branches spread wide, gathering sunlight the way I gather warmth from the mud, from the kettle, from the quiet hum that slips through my ribs. When I remember to stand still, I step off the porch onto the damp grass, the cold soaking through my socks in an instant, grounding me here in a way the swirl cannot touch. I walk to the edge of the yard where the trail waits, the path narrow and soft, the underbrush pressing close on either side, as if to remind me that not all drift lifts you upward. Sometimes it draws you deeper into what grows quiet and slow under the canopy. I follow the path until I reach the clearing, the stones cool with dew, the moss dark and soft under my palms. When I lower myself to sit, I close my eyes and listen to the hush here, different from the hush on the porch, thicker and more patient, the hush of roots and damp earth, and the small life that moves without hurry. I think of the swirl again, drifting far above this patch of ground that holds my body for now, pressing itself tighter in the dark where light waits to be born. I think of the particles drifting toward each other, pulled by a gravity that knows how to hold without asking how to gather, without claiming how to warm, without burning away. I breathe into that thought, the hush gathering behind my ribs until my heartbeat matches the slow pulse of this place where the swirl above finds its echo in the swirl below. Roots tangled deep, stone pressed tight, moss softening the hard edges the way my breath softens the questions that wake me before dawn. I open my eyes to the canopy shifting above me, the light now pushing through in thin gold ribbons that catch on needles and branches, turning the clearing into a small galaxy of broken sun. The hush does not lift, it only thins enough for the small sounds to find their place, a bird calling once, then gone, a leaf drifting loose to brush my shoulder before settling at my feet. I rise slowly, feeling the cold slip from the stone into my bones, a reminder that warmth must be carried with care. The drift is only gentle when you remember to hold the hush close. I follow the path back, each step pressing the earth flat, then lifting, leaving behind only the faintest trace that I'd passed this way, that I listened, that I carried the swirl with me even here in the hush between trees. When I reach the porch, the kettle is cool, the mug empty, the telescope waiting for the night to gather again. I stand there one last moment, looking up at the bright sky that hides the swirl from my eyes, but not from my knowing. I whisper a soft promise to return, to lift the cover, to lean in, to drift close enough to listen for the warmth waiting in the hush behind the glass. I spend the day with my hands busy trying to keep my thoughts from drifting too far into the hush that still hums behind my ribs. After the dawn has pressed its light into every corner of this small house, I sweep the porch boards, brushing away pine needles that collect like tiny memories of the trees that stand patient at the edge of my yard. I wash the mug, the kettle, the dish I used for breakfast, each swirl of water a small echo of the swirl above that waits for night to gather it back into my sight. I pause at the window when I dry my hands, my fingertips pressed against the cool glass, as I watch the branches shift in the breeze that slips through without asking permission. The hush never leaves entirely. I think it only hides in places that do not need my questions to stay whole, in the kitchen, in the creak of floorboards, in the quiet tick of the clock that measures each breath. Whether I notice or not, I step outside again, bare feet on sun-warmed boards, the blanket draped over my arm. Though the day is too warm for it, the habit comforts me, a reminder that the hush can be carried even when the sun tries to scatter it. I stand there for a while, eyes half closed, feeling the warmth of light soak into my shoulders, my spine, the crown of my head. I think about the swirl drifting far above this soft patch of earth, patient as ever, holding its slow spin, its hush of sleepy matter pressed close enough to glow. I imagine what it would feel like to drift there, to feel the pull of gravity, not as a threat, but as an invitation to belong. I turn my face up to the clear sky, blue and wide and empty of stars, but I know they're there waiting behind the bright, ready to slip back through when the dusk folds its hush over the yard again. I lower my gaze to the trail that winds past the first line of pines, the path narrow and soft underfoot, marked by the faint impression of my own steps and the small shuffle of deer that pass through when the yard falls quiet. I follow it slowly, the sun warm on my shoulders, the hush shifting as I move deeper, where the canopy thickens and the light breaks into dappled patterns on the ground. I think of the swirl with each step, of the way particles drift and gather, how they press close under the watchful pull of gravity, how they do not rush but simply trust the hush to hold them until the warmth comes. I wonder if the hush here in the trees hums with that same promise, if the roots press close underground like particles, waiting for warmth, waiting for the next slow breath of rain to coax them deeper. I pause by an old fallen trunk, its bark rough under my palm, where I rest my hand, feeling the cold seep into my skin, the moss soft where it has gathered itself in the cracks and hollows. I sit there for a while, my back against the wood, my eyes half closed, listening to the way the hush here folds around me, thicker than the breeze that brushes the tips of my hair. The swirl feels nearer here, not in sight, but in the slow pulse that moves through my chest. When I match my breathing to the rustle of needles overhead, I think of the light drifting across all the empty space, how it carries memory without knowing it, how it folds its old warmth into a beam so thin it can slip through my telescope's glass, find the curve of my eye, press itself into my ribs, as a question that never really needs an answer, only my looking, only my listening, only my quiet promise to return each night when the dusk opens, the hush wide enough to hold me. I lift my head to watch the branches sway, shadows flickering across my face like the faint trace of drifting dust in a beam of light. I imagine how the particles that make this wood, the bark, the moss, once drifted far above, pressed into flame and then scattered again until gravity caught them once more, folding them into new shapes that grew into roots and trunks that hold this hush steady long after I stand and leave it behind. I rise, brushing bark and moss from my back, feeling the faint ache in my legs from sitting too still for too long. The hush clings to my sleeves as I walk back down the trail, pressing into my shoulders in the way the swirl presses sleepy matter together until it remembers how to burn, the way warmth is born not from force but from patience, from drifting close enough that the hush cannot help but crack open. When I reach the yard, the sun has begun its slow drop behind the pines, the light turning softer, leaning gold across the grass and the boards of the porch. I stand for a moment at the edge of the steps, my feet cool against the last warmth the wood holds. I imagine the swirl already turning above the blue, already folding the first faint points of light back into view, though my eyes cannot yet catch them. I step inside, to the kettle, to the mug, to the quiet work of warming water, the steam rising in slow curls that remind me of the way my breath looks when I stand on the porch in the cold night air, pressing my questions against the hush. I carry the mug back outside, cradling it with both hands, letting the heat slip into my palms As I settle into the old chair, the blanket pulled around my shoulders, though the air still holds a touch of day's warmth, the hush drifts back and pressing close along the porch boards through the pine branches above my head. In the soft creak of the house behind me, I sit slowly, feeling the warmth settle behind my ribs, where the squirrel hums, waiting for my eye to find it again when the dark deepens enough to pull it from hiding. I set the mug down carefully on the railing, the wood catching a faint ring of warmth. Where the ceramic rests, I stand and lift the cover from the telescope, my fingers brushing the cold metal, feeling the memory of all the nights I have leaned here, pressing my face to the glass, letting the swirl drift inside my sight until it settles like a small secret I carry back to bed. When the hush softens me into sleep, I lean in now, though the sky still holds more blue than black. The first stars just shy ghosts at the edge of seeing. I find the faint shape anyway, the swirl patient as ever, waiting for my breath to fog the lens, for my ribs to remember that warmth is something gathered slowly through closeness, through the hush, through the promise that drifting does not mean alone. I stay there, pressed close to the glass, my hand steady on the tripod, my breath quiet against the hush that folds the swirl and the porch and the house and the soft small shape of me into something held the same way gravity holds sleepy matter until it cannot help but glow. The night settles like a careful hand across the yard, pressing down the last warmth left behind by the sun, so it can sink into the soil and feed the roots that wait beneath the damp grass. I stand on the porch, feeling the hush gather around my shoulders, the blanket wrapped close enough to catch the drift of my breath each time I exhale into the cold that has begun to creep out from the dark spaces between the pines. I hold the mug in both hands, its steam curling across my chin as I lift it to my lips, each swallow a small reminder that warmth is something I can carry even when the hush wants to slip under my skin and fold me into its patient quiet. The kettle is inside, cooling now, its song finished for the night, but its promise remains in the cup I cradle here under the sky. I step to the railing, resting the mug beside the old mark scratched into the wood where my fingers trace the same line each night. Before I lift the cover from the telescope, I pause here, letting my eyes drift up past the edge of the roof, past the black branches that rake across the stars, past the first faint shape of the swirl, waiting where it always waits for my eye to find it again. I think about how many nights I have stood here, pressing my heartbeat into the hush, trying to listen for an answer I do not really expect to hear. I think about the way the swirl holds its shape, patient and slow, even as new light pushes out from the center, carrying its warmth away from the press of gravity that first gave it breath. I lift the cover, my fingers brushing cold metal, feeling the hum of memory in the way the tripod settles under my weight, the glass steady, the barrel familiar against my palm. I lean in, and the world narrows, the swirl blooms soft and faint in the circle of the lens, a smear of old light drifting across the hush to land here behind my eye, where it hums like a secret that does not need to be spoken. I think of the particles pressed so close they cannot help but burn the hush, cracking open in places where warmth insists on finding its way through the dark. I wonder if each flicker remembers the drift that brought it here, the long hush that wrapped it before the warmth caught hold. I pull back, blinking at the way the cold glass has marked my cheek with a faint ring. I trace it with my fingertips, smiling at the thought that my skin keeps these small reminders long after I have stepped inside and folded myself into sleep. I glance at the mug, its steam now a thin wisp lifting into the hush that presses down over the yard. The branches sway above me, and I listen to their soft rustle, the sound brushing against the swirl in my mind like wind over old stones. I wonder if the pines know the swirl too, if their roots feel the tug of gravity the same way my thoughts do, drifting upward each night, pressed into the hush that holds my questions even when no answers come. I think about walking the path that slips behind the trees, the clearing where I sit, sometimes with my back against the rough bark, feeling the way the earth hums beneath my spine, the hush thicker, there a swirl of its own gathering, the rustle of leaves, the sigh of needles, the quiet scratch of small life moving unseen in the dark. I imagine that hush now layered over the hush here on the porch, layered over the hush that holds the swirl patient above my roof, a hush that stretches through every breath I draw and release. Here in the dark I lean, and again letting the glass gather my gaze, the swirl sharpens then softens as my eyes adjust to the faintness of its shape, a gathering of sleepy matter caught in the gentle pull of gravity that does not shout but whispers, stay closer, stay warm, stay, until the hush cannot help but break into light. I think about how the swirl does not rush, how its drift is patient, how each particle finds its place not through force, but through the slow dance of pull and press and quiet surrender. I wonder if I could live like that, pressing closer to what holds warmth, letting my small questions drift without needing them to land in any shape other than this hush that cradles me here on these old porch boards. I breathe out my breath, fogging the lens for a moment before the cold glass clears again, showing me the swirl right where I left it, unchanged by my looking, unchanged by my wanting, unchanged by my quiet promise to come back tomorrow, and the night after, and the night after that. As long as the hush keeps its door open for me, I rest my hand on the telescope, feeling the steady hum of the metal under my palm, the way it holds the cold, the way it holds my warmth in the prints I leave behind. I wonder how many nights have slipped past like this, how many breaths have drifted out of my mouth into the hush above the pines, how many small wishes I have whispered without sound, pressing them into the swirl the way light presses warmth into the dark. I step back and lift the mug, my fingers wrapped tight around the cooling ceramic, sipping the last swallow that has gone lukewarm, but still tastes of comfort, still tastes of the hush that waits inside the kettle. Each time I strike a match and set the water to sing, I close my eyes, letting the swirl drift behind my eyelids, its shape softer here, but no less clear, a faint spiral pressed into the dark, a promise that what drifts alone will always find its gravity, that what gathers will always find its warmth, that what glows will always send its memory outward into the hush, where it will land. Somewhere in a waiting I open my eyes, and the stars overhead blink steady and quiet. The branches sway a little more in the breeze that lifts the edge of my blanket and slips under the collar of my shirt, reminding me that the hush holds cold too, that warmth must be carried close, must be coaxed from steam and breath, and the small soft press of my ribs around my heart. I lean in one last time, letting the swirl settle in my sight, until my eyes blur, until the hush folds so close I can hear my own heartbeat in the glass, a quiet echo of all the drifting sleepy matter that once pressed itself into the warmth that makes me me. I smile at that, at the thought that the swirl is not separate from the small breath I draw here in the cold, not separate from the mug or the kettle or the old boards under my feet, or the trail that waits behind the trees, or the hush that will gather me into sleep when I finally step inside and let the night hold the swirl until I return to lean in again. When the morning comes, it slips in quietly, as if it knows the hush is not quite ready to lift its weight from the boards of the porch or the cold curve of the telescope that still remembers the warmth of my breath pressed against its glass. I stand by the kitchen window, watching the first light stretch thin fingers across the yard, brushing the frost from the tips of the grass where it curled itself tight during the night. I hold my mug with both hands, feeling the steam slip past my chin, drifting upward to fog the glass for a heartbeat before the cold outside clears it again. I think about how the swirl must still be there above the pale blue sky that hides its shape from me until the dusk folds itself back over the house. I wonder if the light that left those sleepy gatherings of matter is still drifting even now, pressing through cold space, carrying warmth so faint it might be missed, if not for the way my small telescope catches it and lets it fall into my waiting eye. I sip slowly letting the warmth slip down my throat to settle behind my ribs, where the hush hums even in daylight. I place the mug on the counter and open the door, stepping out onto the porch to breathe the thin morning air that smells of pine and damp earth. The blanket is still draped over the railing where I left it after the kettle had gone silent, and my eyes had grown too heavy to hold the swirl any longer. I pick it up, shaking out the cold, and fold it over my shoulders, the fabric catching the last warmth from my skin, and holding it close. I step off the porch into the yard, where my footprints from the night before have frozen into shallow hollows that glisten in the new light. I press my toes into the frost, feeling the sharp bite of it slip between the threads of my socks, reminding me that the hush belongs to the cold too, that warmth is something I must carry with care. I walk to the edge of the yard, where the trail begins its soft curve into the pines, the branches overhead catching the morning breeze in a hush that sounds like the low hum of my thoughts. When I lean into the telescope at night, I think about the swirl waiting behind the bright sky, how it drifts without hurry, how its particles press close under gravity's soft hand, the same way my questions press close under the hush that folds itself around me. When I sit here alone in the clearing that waits at the end of this trail, I follow the path slowly, the frost crunching under my steps, the hush pressing thicker with each bend. Where the light breaks into smaller pieces between the trunks and falls in pale coins on the damp ground, the clearing opens ahead of me, a circle of soft earth ringed by moss and stones that have held my weight so many times before. I lower myself onto one, feeling the cold slip through the fabric of my pants into my bones, an anchor that keeps my thoughts from drifting too far into the swirl. I close my eyes and listen to the hush, hear the small stir of branches, the low crackle of something unseen moving through the underbrush, the steady thump of my own heart counting out the seconds I cannot see. I think of the swirl above, hidden for now, but no less real, a gathering of sleepy matter pressed so close that warmth cannot help but bloom. I wonder if each particle remembers its own drifting, the long dark that held it before gravity's gentle pull found it and called it home. I wonder if the hush inside me remembers too, if the warmth I hold behind my ribs is made of the same soft promise that what drifts alone will always find its place among this swirl. I open my eyes and trace the rough curve of the stone beneath my hand, the moss damp and cold where it clings to the shadowed side. I think about how even this stone carries the swirl in its bones, particles pressed and scattered, pressed again across time so wide I cannot fold it into my small head without feeling it slip away. I stand brushing the frost from my palm, watching it drift to the ground. Like a sigh, I turn back down the trail, my breath rising in faint clouds that catch the thin light before the breeze folds them into the hush overhead. When I reach the porch again, the sun has lifted higher, but its warmth does not reach the boards where my footprints from the night before linger like soft shadows. I step inside, setting the blanket across the back of the chair where it will wait for dusk. The kettle stands on the stove, cold and quiet, its metal skin reflecting the soft light that slips through the window. I fill it again, listening to the water settle into the hollow where the flame will wake it soon. I light the match, watching the small flare of it catch before I press it to the burner. The hush in the kitchen holds steady, thick enough that I can almost hear the swirl behind the ceiling, above the roof, above the pale sky that waits to fold itself back into black. I stand there while the kettle hums, letting the sound press into the hush, letting the steam curl up to brush my face the same way my breath curls against the cold lens of the telescope. When I lean and I think of the swirl gathering itself, patient and slow, how it spins on its own time, never rushing to scatter, never hurrying to burn, how it trusts gravity to hold what drifts and warmth to follow in its own quiet way. I pour the water into the mug, lifting it to my lips, feeling the heat slip down my throat, settling into the same hollow behind my ribs that remembers the hush even in the bright of day I carry the mug to the porch standing in the doorway. So the warmth of the kitchen brushes my back, while the cold of the yard brushes my face. I look up at the sky, soft blue, wide and empty, but I know the swirl is there waiting behind it, waiting for the dust to fold the hush back over my shoulders, waiting for my breath to fog the glass, waiting for my eye to find the shape I carry behind my eyelids. Even now, when the stars are hidden and the sun asks me to trust that what I cannot see still drifts, still gathers, still burns, patient and slow, I sip, slowly letting the last steam curl into the hush around my face, whispering a small promise that when the night comes, I will lift the cover, lean and press close, let the swirl remind me once more that what drifts will always find its warmth, if only it trusts the hush to hold it long enough to glow. The afternoon drifts across the yard so slowly, I almost forget that time is still moving its quiet hands through the light that slips between the pines. I sit on the porch steps, the blanket bunched behind my back where it keeps the chill of the boards from pressing too sharply into my spine. The mug rests beside me on the top step, its rim catching the thin warmth of the sun that hasn't yet given itself fully to spring, but hints at it in the soft damp smell of thawing soil beneath the patchy grass. I watch a line of ants threading their way across the railing, each one carrying a piece of something larger than itself, a crumb, a shred of bark, a speck of dust that will find its place in some hidden corner of the yard. I think about how they do not rush, how their path seems both aimless and certain, the hush of their tiny movements almost loud against the faint rattle of the breeze in the dry needles above my head. I lift the mug, taking a slow sip that has already cooled but still holds the taste of warmth on my tongue, the taste of last night when I leaned into the telescope long after the hush had wrapped itself around the house, when the swirl waited patient and unchanged behind the glass, when my breath fogged the lens and I closed my eyes for a moment to feel how the quiet gathers behind my ribs and hums there like the low hush of a distant river. I traced the rim of the mug with my fingertip, the ceramic cool and smooth, a small circle that feels like a piece of the swirl caught in my hand. I wonder how many nights I have carried that shape from the porch to my pillow, tucked behind my eyelids, so that even in sleep I drift along the slow curve of particles, pressing close enough to glow. I set the mug down and stand brushing the dry needles from the back of my jeans. As I step off the porch into the yard, my feet sink slightly into the soft earth where the frost has begun to let go my soles, remembering the cold and the hush that hides beneath the soil, waiting for the warmth to return fully before it cracks open in small green bursts. I walk toward the edge of the yard where the path slides between the trees, the same path I have followed since I was young enough to believe that the hush was something I could catch in my hands if I was quiet enough, if I stepped softly enough, if I listened without trying to name what I heard. The pines stand tall on either side, their trunks thick with old bark that splits in long seams wide enough to tuck secrets into if I had any worth. Leaving behind, I trail my fingers along the rough surface, feeling the grain press back against my skin, a steady reminder that drift is not only for the sky, that even here, rooted and unmoving, there is a slow swirl happening beneath the surface, the quiet press of roots against stone and soil, the patient gathering of water and dust and time. The clearing opens ahead of me, the ring of stones damp where the sun has not yet warmed them, the moss dark and soft under my palm. As I lower myself to sit, I lean back, letting the hush settle deeper around my shoulders, the blanket slipping down my back until it pools in the small of my spine, catching the cool breath of earth that lifts through the cracks between stones. I close my eyes and listen to the faint murmur of the wind in the highest branches, the distant tap of a woodpecker somewhere beyond my line of sight, the hush folding these small sounds into something larger than my own breath. I think about the swirl high above, hidden by the pale sky, that pretends it is empty. I think about the sleepy matter drifting patient in its wide arc, pressed together by gravity's steady hand until warmth comes not with force, but with the soft insistence of closeness. I wonder if the swirl knows its own edges, or if it only hums along them, the way I hum to myself sometimes, when the kettle starts its low song on the stove, a quiet melody that means warmth is coming, that the hush will be sweeter with steam. I open my eyes and trace a small spiral in the moss beside my knee, my fingertip leaving a faint path through the green before the shape disappears beneath the damp. I wonder if my questions do the same, slipping into the hush each night to drift along the swirl until they settle against some distant star I will never see with my own eye, but that will send its warmth toward me long after my breath has quieted. I stand slowly brushing the moss from my palm, the hush clinging to my sleeve like a promise. I follow the trail back, my steps careful against the roots that knot the path into small obstacles that keep me awake, keep me from drifting too far into my head before I am ready to sit again on the porch and lean into the swirl. The yard is brighter when I step back into it, the sun lower but warmer now, pressing the last light of day into the boards where I left my mug waiting. I pick it up, cradling the empty circle in my hands, as if it might remind me how small warmth can be, how quiet it can sit against the hush until called forward by breath and match and water. I slip inside to the kettle, filling it again, listening to the soft rush of water against metal, the match flaring against the strike, its sparks small but certain, a bright hush that vanishes as soon as the flame catches. I stand by the stove, my hand resting on the counter, as the kettle begins its slow hum, the swirl in my mind circling behind my eyelids where it never really leaves. I think about how light drifts across distances I can barely name, carrying its secret warmth through empty dark until it lands in the curve of my eye and becomes something I can hold for a moment before it drifts again. I think about how I stand here small and steady, the same particles pressed into bone and blood, drifting too in my own slow way toward the hush that waits when the night folds back over the house, when the porch cools beneath my bare feet, when the telescope stands ready to catch the swirl once more. I pour the water into the mug, the steam rising to brush my face soft and damp, a new hush to carry with me as I step outside again, the blanket over my shoulders, the mug in both hands, the dusk settling around me in slow layers that breathe with each swallow of warmth. I lift the cover from the telescope, my palm flat against the cold barrel, feeling the memory of last night pressed into the metal, my fingertips finding the same small groove worn smooth by years of leaning close. I breathe out the hush, catching my breath, carrying it upward to mingle with the first stars that slip through the dark. I lean in the swirl, waiting patient, unchanged by my small warmth, unchanged by the quiet questions I press against it, unchanged by the hush that holds us both steady for one more night. The night comes softly, as if it has learned how to knock on my door without sound, and I answer without needing to rise from my chair on the porch where I have been waiting for the last threads of daylight to slip behind the line of pines that guard the edge of my small world. The mug sits beside me half full, its steam rising in thin curls that catch the porch light before dissolving into the dark that gathers around the roof, the railing, the old boards that remember my footsteps in the hush that deepens with every breath I let out into the cooling air. The blanket wraps my shoulders, the fabric pulled snug around my ribs where the warmth pools like a small echo of the kettle's steady hum inside the house. I watch the first stars blink, awake patient, tiny fires scattered across a canvas too wide for my eyes to hold all at once. I think about how many nights I have sat here tracing the same soft shape in my thoughts, the swirl drifting behind my eyelids even when the sky pretends it is empty. I breathe in the hush, letting it settle into the space between my shoulder blades where the weight of the day slides off piece by piece until all that is left is the quiet and the faint hum that comes when I remember how small I am, and how that smallness fits perfectly into the drift that holds the swirl. I reach for the telescope, my fingers brushing the cold metal, feeling the way it greets me with the same hush every night, the same promise that what waits beyond the lens is not so far from the steam that slips from the rim of my mug, or the warmth that presses into my spine. When I lean back against the chair, I lift the cover slowly, setting it down on the railing where it rocks once before settling still as the hush. I lean forward, letting my eye find the glass, the faint circle of light that pulls the swirl closer until it blooms in the narrow tunnel of my sight. I see it, the soft arc, the sleepy matter pressed into its slow spin, light gathered from the hush that wrapped it long before my breath ever fogged this lens. I wonder who else sees it tonight, whose eyes catch the same faint smear of ancient glow drifting through cold space on its way to land behind an eyelid that will close again when the hush grows heavy. I wonder if they too hold a mug warm in their hands, if they too let the hush press into their ribs until the questions stop asking for answers and start humming instead, a slow, low tune that drifts from bone to bone. I breathe out my breath, fogging the glass for a heartbeat before the swirl sharpens again, unchanged by the warmth that slips from my lips into the hush that waits between my skin and the cold barrel of the telescope. I think about the way particles drift and gather, how they move toward each other with a patience that shames my small rush to understand. I think about how gravity holds what drifts, pulling sleepy matter into the soft swirl that presses warmth into the hush until it cracks open into light. I wonder if the swirl remembers when it was only dark dust spread wide across an emptiness so deep that even time hesitated before stepping forward. I wonder if that first press of closeness felt like surrender, or if it felt like a promise that warmth would come if only the hush could hold steady long enough for the drift to find its shape. I sit back, blinking against the faint ring of cold the lens leaves against my cheek. My mug waits on the railing, the steam gone, but the warmth still caught in the ceramic walls. I lift it to my lips, sipping what is left, feeling it slip down my throat to settle behind my sternum, where the hush has built its small nest. I listen to the branches creak above my head, the pines shifting in the night breeze, a sound that reminds me of the way the swirl hums in my mind when I close my eyes and picture it not as light, but as a hush made visible, a shape born from the slow drift of dust that trusted gravity more than it trusted the emptiness. I stand, the blanket slipping from one shoulder as I adjust the tripod, nudging the telescope a fraction so the swirl drifts back into view. My breath catches as the shape sharpens, the faint arc brighter tonight than it was yesterday, or maybe my eyes have learned how to see it more clearly with each hush I lean into. I wonder if seeing is really just remembering, if the light that lands behind my eye does not so much show me something new as remind me of something my bones have always known. I wonder if the same particles that press against each other in that swirl once pressed against each other inside the old iron that hums in my blood, or the breath that fogs the glass, or the warmth that wraps my ribs when I tuck the blanket closer. I wonder if drifting is not about leaving but about returning in slow loops, so wide we cannot see the circle until the hush folds us into its quiet arms. I press my eye closer to the lens, watching the swirl tremble at the edge of my vision, the faint light steady, the sleepy matter holding its shape against the endless dark that tries to pull it apart. I think about how it resists, not with force, but with closeness, how each particle trusts its neighbor enough to press tighter, how warmth grows in that quiet faith. I breathe out again, the swirl blurring before clearing. As the glass settles into the hush, I imagine my breath drifting through the lens, curling around the sleepy matter, pressing closer in some secret language that only gravity understands. I step back, lifting my face to the sky, the swirl hidden now behind the roof, behind the glass, behind the hush that lives between my eyelashes. I carry its shape there blinking into the dark where the pines sway, and the breeze tugs the blanket loose again. I reach for the mug, my fingers cold against the empty curve that still holds the ghost of steam. I think of the kettle waiting inside, the match waiting in its box, the low hiss that will rise when flame finds water, the hush that will slip through the kitchen while I stand in the doorway watching the dark gather its soft edges around this small house. I think of the swirl waiting, unchanged by my looking, unchanged by my questions, unchanged by the hush that hums through my ribs. When I remember that drifting does not mean lost, that gathering does not mean finished, that warmth is not given, but made each time sleepy matter trusts the hush enough to stay close, I turn back to the telescope, leaning in once more, letting the lens catch my breath one last time before I step inside and let the kettle remind me how simple it is to make warmth. When the night has done its work, when the hush has done its work, when the swirl has done its work, drifting, pressing, gathering, holding me just long enough to remember that I too am part of what glows behind the glass, and behind my ribs, and behind the hush that waits patient for my return. I wake in the soft hush just before dawn, when the house feels lighter than its own walls, and the air inside my room holds the cold edge of the night that hasn't fully slipped away. I lie there a moment, feeling how my breath fills the quiet, how the swirl hums behind my eyelids, even without the telescope, even without the lens to catch its light and fold it into my sight. I wonder if the swirl drifts through my dreams when I am not looking, if it leaves its shape in the corners of my thoughts like a gentle hand pressed to the small of my back, guiding me through sleep toward waking. I push the blanket back and stand barefoot on the wooden floor, letting the chill rise through my soles, as if the hush needs to remind me that warmth is never something to hold forever, but something to find again each time I step forward into the dark. I walk to the kitchen, my fingers trailing along the smooth edge of the counter. The kettle waits on the stove, its metal skin cool against my palm when I lift it to fill it again with water that hums in a low swirl inside the hollow. As it settles, I strike the match, the flame small and sudden in the hush, before it flickers down into the blue tongue that catches under the kettle. I lean on the counter while I wait, eyes half closed, listening to the soft tick of the metal warming, the hush curling around the steam that begins to gather inside the spout. I think about the swirl turning far above the roof, hidden now behind the pale gray of a sky that hasn't yet decided to lift its veil for the sun. I think about how light drifts even when I sleep, how it slips through the hush carrying its warmth across impossible distances just to rest for a moment against my waiting eye. When I stand on the porch later tonight, I pour the water. When the kettle breathes its first sharp hiss, steam rising to meet my chin in a damp sigh that settles against my skin, I wrap my hands around the mug and stand at the window, feeling the heat seep through my palms into my ribs, into the space behind my heart that holds the shape of the swirl like a quiet promise. I watch the first line of sun break the edge of the pines, the shadows long and slow across the yard, touching the trail that winds behind the house, where the hush grows thickest under the canopy where I go when I need the swirl closer than the lens can bring it. I think about how each time I walk there my steps press into soil that remembers water and root and the slow drift of seasons that carry particles from one shape to another, the same patient gathering that happens above me in the swirl, only slower, maybe only quieter, maybe only hidden under bark and moss instead of tucked behind the thin hush of night. I open the door, stepping onto the porch, boards cool and smooth under my bare feet, the mug warm in my hands, the blanket draped across my shoulders from where I pulled it off the chair in the corner of my room. I stand there breathing in the hush that settles into my hair, into the hollow at the base of my throat, into the soft part of my chest that waits each day for this quiet hour when the sky and the ground and my thoughts all seem to drift in the same slow circle. I sip slowly, letting the warmth bloom behind my ribs, a small swirl pressed into the hush that hums just under the birdsong that begins when the light lifts fully into the branches. I watch the breeze catch the tops of the pines, the way they sway, so gently they might be whispering to each other some old truth about what it means to stand still and drift at the same time. I think of the swirl overhead, how it holds its shape not by force, but by trust, each particle giving up its own small drift to the larger pull that keeps the hush from fraying apart. I wonder if I am any different if this breath, and this sip, and this quiet morning stand here, because I trust that the hush will hold me the same way the swirl holds its sleepy matter. Until warmth comes, I step down into the grass damp with the last breath of night, cool enough that my toes curl into the blades, while the rest of me leans forward toward the trail that waits like a soft line of memory behind the pines. I walk there, careful not to spill the mug, careful not to wake the hush more than I have to, each step pressing into the dark earth that still remembers frost even as it lets go of winter's slow grip. The branches close over me, the light breaks into smaller pieces, soft coins that slip across my shoulders, across the curve of my mug, across my breath as it leaves my lips and disappears into the hush. I reach the clearing and lower myself onto the same old stone that holds my shape like a memory, my knees drawn up so I can rest the mug against them. While I watch the steam drift upward, I close my eyes and picture the swirl turning far above this patch of earth, how its sleepy matter drifts closer each moment, pressed tighter by gravity's hush until warmth cracks it open again. I wonder if the clearing knows. It hums with its own swirl, the roots pressed deep, the moss soft against the stone, the tiny insects threading their way under the bark and leaf, pressing small particles into new shapes that hum with the same promise of warmth. I think about how I carry the swirl back to this house each night, how I lift the cover, lean and breathe out fog the lens, feel the hush catch my breath and hold it for a heartbeat before it fades into the dark. I think about how every time I stand there my ribs press closer to the shape of the swirl until it feels less like something out there and more like something already here, patient behind my eyes, patient behind my ribs, patient in the slow warmth of my own small breath. I open my eyes, the clearing brighter now, the hush softer but no less certain. As the sun lifts its slow weight over the tops of the trees, I sip the last of the warmth and stand brushing the moss from my palm, my steps soft on the path back to the yard, back to the porch, back to the kettle, waiting for dusk, when its song will rise again and the hush will fold over the roof and the swirl will wait unchanged for the curve of my eye pressed close to the cold glass. I step up onto the boards, the mug empty but still warm in my hand. I trace my finger along the tripod where it stands near the railing, the same groove worn smooth by the countless nights I have leaned in here, breathing into the hush that carries my breath upward into the swirl that drifts patient across distances too wide to measure. I whisper a small promise to the shape that waits behind the dusk, that I will return tonight and tomorrow, and as long as the hush keeps its soft door open to my questions, my warmth, my drift, my small hope that what glows in the swirl glows in me too, ready to gather, ready to burn just enough to light the hush from the inside out.